So you've been watching some images on a loop for the last several minutes. If I asked you to identify the thread that ties all of those images together, I might hear some things like, they're all famous. They represent important contributors to our history. They represent inventions and works of art that changed our world. I might not hear that they all represent the work of individuals with autism. Now, it would be really difficult for me to tell you for certain that William Shakespeare or Vincent van Gogh or Charles Schulz had autism. However, I can tell you that a whole lot has been written about all of those individuals whose work was represented by those pictures to suggest that they exhibited the kinds of social communication and or sensory characteristics common to individuals with autism spectrum disorder. Sometimes the students with autism spectrum disorder on our campuses experience challenges. Sometimes we as practitioners experience challenges in supporting the students on our campus who have autism spectrum disorder. But before we spend any time at all talking about those challenges, I wanted to take a minute to recognize what an incredible opportunity we have as practitioners to support the students who view the world in a way that others can't. Students whose unique worldviews, as you just saw, have the power to change the world. And that's pretty exciting to be a part of. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jill Walters. I'm currently a graduate hall director at Bowling Green State University. I started my career in student affairs a number of years ago at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in admissions. Worked most recently as a full-time hall director at Hiram College in Hiram, Ohio. My interest in supporting students with autism spectrum disorder started at GLACUHO's Camp Tecumseh 3 years ago when I was working as a member of the Student Learning Committee. We were brainstorming areas where practitioners might need to know a bit more in order to support students. And I said I could do that, I can learn about that, and since then have had really wonderful opportunities to speak with practitioners across areas in student affairs, housing professionals, parents, students, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today to share some information. Today we're going to talk about some statistics, an autism spectrum overview, the characteristics of autism spectrum disorder, some strategies to help, and then we'll have time for some questions. We're going to start with statistics. Basically, I'm going to tell you what the Center for Disease Control is telling us about the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder in the United States, why those numbers are changing so significantly, and then what that means for us on our college campuses. Then we're going to talk about the autism spectrum. What the heck is it? There's a lot of language that is attached to autism spectrum disorder. Even the name sounds complicated. So we're going to try and simplify that a little bit. Then we're going to talk about some characteristics. And it isn't absolutely everything that we know is associated with autism spectrum disorder. It's the stuff that's most relevant for your work. Then we're going to talk about some strategies to help. That's why you're here, how you're going to be able to best support your students. Then we're going to have some time for some questions. So let's go ahead and get started with those statistics. This is the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder. In 1980, 1 in 10,000. In 1990, 1 in 500. In the year 2000, 1 in 250. And today, 1 in 110. Now this is the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder in the United States, individuals between the ages of 3 and 17, according to the Center for Disease Control. Holy cow, that is a really significant increase in the number of individuals with an autism spectrum disorder. So why in the world is that happening? All the way from 1 in 10,000 to today, 1 in 110. Well, there are a number of reasons. First, we know a lot more about autism spectrum disorder today than we did in 1980. You're seeing a lot of representations of autism in popular culture and in the media. For example, the new Queen Latifah movie, Joyful Noise, her son is portrayed in that movie as having Asperger syndrome. There was an episode of Extreme Makeover Home Edition in December where they were building a home for a family with an individual with an autism spectrum disorder. So not only are you seeing portrayals in popular culture and the media, and these are sort of positive portrayals, but you're also there's just a lot more information available to parents, to teachers, to educators, getting folks a diagnosis when they may not have received one 10, 20, 30 years ago. Also, there's a decrease in stigma surrounding the word autism, and you all being here today is evidence of that. We're trying to learn and support individuals instead of labeling. The stigma actually stems from an individual, well, some of it anyway, stems from an individual named Dr. Bruno Bettelheim, and he coined that term refrigerator mothers. Basically, Dr. Bettelheim said, I know why autism is happening. I can tell you exactly why it's happening. It's because mothers are missing a critical bonding moment with their children. So we know now that that isn't true. We know that there's a genetic cause and potentially some environmental factors that play a role in autism. It doesn't have to do with that family link, but a lot of the pain that sort of surrounded that when Dr. Bettelheim was perpetuating that theory, a lot of that is still around and was around for a long time. So individuals and families would do anything to have their child not be labeled as an individual with autism. And fortunately, again, we're seeing a decrease in that. And the last is the broadening of definitions. You're going to hear that the autism spectrum includes 3 disorders. And those disorders vary greatly in terms of characteristics and severity of those characteristics. And those definitions are continually changing. They're changing even now. There have been articles just in January and the beginning part of February about those definitions changing. So as those definitions change, those individuals who receive a diagnosis of autism, those numbers are increasing. So what does that mean for you? The statistics are important to us because they tell us that the population of individuals with autism spectrum disorder on our campuses, it's increasing and it will continue to increase. So now that we know a bit about the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder, let's talk about exactly what an autism spectrum disorder is. The autism spectrum is exactly that. A spectrum of disorders that impact the way that an individual experiences and interacts with the environment, specifically related to behavior, communication, and social interaction. Autism is called a spectrum disorder because no one individual with autism looks exactly like any other. And individuals can range from those able to function extremely well in the neurotypical world and who have well above average intelligence, like Einstein, to those who are completely nonverbal and with whom we've not yet learned to communicate. There are 3 disorders that fall into the category of autism spectrum disorder or pervasive developmental disorders. They are autism, Asperger syndrome, or pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. We're going to refer to that one as PDD-NOS. The abbreviation's a little easier than the full name for that one. So there's those 3 disorders that fall on that spectrum. Let's talk first about autism. Autism is characterized by restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior and interests, impaired social interaction, and impaired communication and/or language development. We're going to talk specifically about what all that jargon means in a minute, but essentially you're looking at all 3 of those items when you're talking about autism. When you're talking about Asperger's, you're talking about that same restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior or interests. You're still talking about that impaired social interaction. The key difference is with Asperger's, you have normal communication and language development. So these are folks who have the words. The problem comes in with pragmatics and social speech, sort of using the language. That's where you see the deficit there with Asperger's. It's also important to note that with autism, individuals can be anywhere on the spectrum in terms of cognitive ability, all the way from an individual with mental retardation to somebody who has well above average intelligence. With Asperger's, this is only individuals with average to above average intelligence on that scale. The final category that we need to discuss is PDD-NOS, or one more time, that's pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. Here you have those restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior or interests, or impaired social interaction, or impaired communication and language development. So PDD-NOS is for individuals who have some of the characteristics of an autism spectrum disorder but do not meet diagnostic characteristics for one of the other two. For some individuals, their diagnosis is really important. However, because the disorders are so closely linked, others might not identify as Asperger's or PDD-NOS, but simply as an individual with autism. Again, no one individual with any of these autism spectrum disorders is going to exhibit exactly the same characteristics in the same way as any other individual. But we're going to speak some about general characteristics that you might see. So let's start there. These are the primary characteristics on which we're going to focus today: communication and social deficits and sensory integration challenges. First, let's talk about social and communication deficits. I want you to imagine with me that you are in a courtroom. You are sitting on the jury and watching the defendant being interviewed on the stand by the prosecuting attorney. So far, that defendant, that individual on the stand, has not made direct eye contact, even once, with the prosecutor or any member of the jury or the judge. What might you think about that person? That individual is lying. That individual is untrustworthy. That person is hiding something. They must be. They've got to be guilty. That person is weird. Would you immediately think that person might have an autism spectrum disorder? Probably not, but that could absolutely be the reason for that lack of eye contact. You'll see individuals who have difficulty or discomfort making any eye contact, or those who make too much eye contact. That's just one of the communication and social deficits about which we're going to speak, but communication and social deficits are tough for individuals coming from a neurotypical perspective sometimes to understand, because it's really easy to make those snap judgments about the things that we see and hear and observe. So part of what we're learning today is to stop and understand that there may be a different cause for some of those things that we're going to see. So let's take a look at some of those other communication and social deficits. First, challenges following the thread of a conversation. And not only following the conversation, but understanding how and how often it's appropriate to contribute, how to do that. You might see individuals who frequently interrupt or try and change the subject, or change the subject to a preferred topic consistently. That understanding how to follow a conversation and how to contribute to it, sometimes that's pretty tough for individuals with an autism spectrum disorder. Next, understanding non-literal speech. Things like metaphor and sarcasm, the implications of tone. Some of those things are often lost on an individual with an autism spectrum disorder. Making sense of those pieces. Think about how much of the content of a message is about the words and how much of it is about other signals. Other signals like reading gestures and facial expressions, body language, is also something that's tough for folks. So again, let's think about how much of the message is about the words and how much is about some of those other pieces. What's the difference between, I am so excited, I'm jumping up and down, I'm waving my hands at you, I'm so excited, and I am so excited. I'm slouching, you can hear the sarcasm in my tone, right? The words are exactly the same, but the statement means something that is completely different. How about, you look really hot? And you look really hot. right? We know that there's a difference in the messages of those two statements, but that difference, that nuance, might be lost on an individual with an autism spectrum disorder. Our hope is that by the time students reach our campuses, they have lots of items in their toolboxes to negotiate those challenges. Some individuals will be really proficient in doing that, and other folks will still have a lot of room to grow. I get asked all the time by practitioners, what am I supposed to do if I see something like that happening where clearly the individual is missing the social or communicative signal? What should I do about that? So my question in response to that is always, if your friend has spinach in their teeth, do you tell them about it? If I have spinach in my teeth, I hope you tell me. Absolutely I do. And that's what our students hope from us in general, right? So we're going to talk a little bit later about how important the relationship building piece is to supporting these students. So hopefully you have enough of a relationship that you might know how to approach that with that student and tell the truth about what you see that's going on. That relationship is really going to help you to develop the rapport that's necessary to approach those situations if and when you see them. In addition to social and communication deficits, like I said, we need to chat about sensory integration challenges. Students can either be hyposensitive, meaning that not a lot of the sensory signals are getting through, or they can be hyposensitive, where folks are particularly sensitive to or easily overwhelmed by sensory information. In order to understand sensory integration challenges before we get specific, let's take a look at a scenario and start that conversation. Kevin has an autism spectrum disorder and is anxious about starting college. The day finally comes when he and his parents drive to school. Kevin has not talked the entire trip. Kevin gets to college, finds the residence hall, and meets you, the hall director, who gives him his keys, shows him the way to his room. You stand outside as Kevin opens the room door and sees that one of his roommates, Joe, has already arrived and set up his side of the room. There are sports and music posters everywhere, and the music is blaring. Joe approaches Kevin, shakes his hand, pats him on the back, saying, "Yo, dude, we're going to be roommates." Take a minute to think about that scenario. If you're sitting by yourself, if you're sitting in a group, take a minute to chat about it. If somebody has an issue processing some sensory information, too much or not enough is getting through, where might be the pitfalls or the challenges of that situation for those folks? So I've identified a couple of locations, and if you found others, that's wonderful. So you'll see them highlighted in green on your screen here. Joe has already arrived and set up his side of the room. So we're going to talk some about how important things like lights and windows and placement, how important those things are. So if an individual comes to a room and all of that has already been decided, that could potentially be challenging for that person. There are sports and music posters everywhere. So if the walls are covered with all sorts of things that are really bright and busy, and you have somebody for whom that's really distracting, that's maybe not the best environment for that person to be. And the music is blaring. So if you have somebody who is really sensitive to auditory information, that music is really going to set that person on edge and make them uncomfortable. Next, this individual who's going to be his roommate pats him on the back. It's pretty common to see individuals with autism spectrum disorder who are really sensitive to touch, very tactily sensitive, and don't like to be touched. So here you have somebody, an individual with autism, who's maybe sensitive about one or all of those items and walks into an environment that is immediately really overwhelming for that person or could potentially be overwhelming. So let's talk about how we as professionals are going to mediate that. First, if you have an individual who has disclosed or an autism spectrum disorder to you before move-in even happens, maybe that individual gets to move in a little bit early to make the environment make sense. We're going to talk a little bit later about how some individuals have a really significant dependence on routine. So allowing just a day or two to make that routine make sense before you have a roommate added to the mix might be really helpful. Next, help in having the conversation. If you do have individuals who are living together and you see this conflict happen, maybe it happens on day one and maybe it happens 3 months in, but we do what we would do for any student with roommate contracts or whatever the situation is in helping folks to negotiate and mediate that situation. Finally, there's a big question about whether or not a single room is the best idea for an individual with an autism spectrum disorder. Pretty good practice, if you can do it, is for individuals who do have a lot of these sensory integration challenges or dependence on routine, is a single room in a suite. If you can do that, because then you still have the sort of social contact that comes along with living in a residence hall without necessarily having to sacrifice some of that privacy and environment. So that's pretty good. A lot of individuals have roommates and are really successful in that as well. So there's a lot of options there, but that's certainly a possibility to help mediate some of these issues. So let's go back to looking at the kinds of sensory integration challenges that we might experience. Sensory integration challenges related to sight. Things that might impact someone who is really sensitive to that visual sensory information. Things like the lights in your residence halls. Are they fluorescent? Are there lots of them? Is the lighting really dim? Things like windows. On what side of the building are the windows? Do you want to put an individual with a visual sensory integration challenge in the room where they get a ton of direct sunlight and are really sensitive to that? Probably not. Things like lots of bright colors in the hallways, in the bathrooms. Somebody may be sensitive to those sorts of things, and just understanding that that may be the cause of some discomfort or someone being overwhelmed. Next, hearing. Individuals who are particularly sensitive to auditory stimulation, a residence hall is a really tough place for that person to be. And while you don't have any control over students playing their music or students talking in the hallways or those kinds of things, the things we can control are things like placing that student next to the laundry room. Not the place you want that person to be because they can hear the machines. Placing that person near the bathroom because of the sound of toilets flushing and showers running. Things like placing that person near the doors that would be consistently opening and closing. In a hallway that has carpet as opposed to bare floors. Those are easy sorts of things to think about if you have someone who is particularly sensitive to that auditory stimulus. Next, taste. And this one is more applicable to dining than it is for individuals in residence halls, but you may see the results of some of the things related to a taste sensory integration challenge. A lot of folks with autism spectrum disorder are very sensitive about the kinds of foods that they will eat. Maybe it has directly to do with taste. Sometimes it has to do with texture or with color. We're going to see a segment from a book a little later called Aquamarine Blue 5. It is a series of essays written by college students with autism spectrum disorder, and there's a woman in that book who writes about how her RA sat her down and as sort of an intervention about, I think you have an eating disorder. It turns out that this student with an autism spectrum disorder wasn't eating because she was very particular about the foods that she would eat, and they didn't have them in the dining hall, so she wasn't eating. But immediately an assumption was made, well, she's not eating, she must have an eating disorder. And really, it was about a sensory integration challenge associated with her autism. Something else to think about, smells. Are there lots of perfumes and shampoos in the restroom that's too overwhelming for somebody? Maybe an accommodation might be that a private space to do that needs to happen. Things like the kinds of cleaning products that are used. An individual who's very sensitive to touch has a lot of tactile sensitivity. I heard a story very recently from a practitioner who said that his nephew went to college and actually was having an issue with hygiene. This individual had an autism spectrum disorder and wasn't showering because the shower was too tactily uncomfortable and there was no bathtub in the residence hall. So what you had was what presented as a situation about hygiene and was really about a touch tactile sensitivity. It's important for us to keep in mind that there might be a tactile sensitivity related to touch so that we do not touch students. Sometimes even just a pat on the shoulder might be enough to send somebody into a meltdown depending on how sensitive they are. So we've talked about the two primary characteristics, sensory integration challenges and social and communication deficits. Let's talk just briefly about a couple of other things that are pretty common that you might see. First, interest limitations. It's pretty common for an individual on the autism spectrum disorder to have an area or areas about which they know absolutely everything. Sort of a frequency to perseverate on a topic, want to talk about nothing else, right? So for the very first time in someone's academic career, they are potentially in the very best place. Because we know on a college campus you can spend 80% of your academic time talking about one topic or studying one area. The issues that you might see arise around that other 20% of the coursework, because you know that typically you can't finish that college degree without taking poetry or art or music appreciation or that science class or whatever it is, and maybe that's not the preferred area of interest. So you have someone who's getting to learn a lot about something that's really important to them, but also needs to find motivation for those other kinds of pieces. Next, reliance on routine. I know that we mentioned this earlier, but a lot of individuals like to do things in the same way, in the same order every day. If we know one thing about working on a college campus, it's that nothing happens typically that way. There are a lot of routine disruptions and things, and so our hope is that students have been really challenged about that by the time they reach us, and some will have wonderful items in their toolbox to cope with those routine disruptions, and others won't. And that's something that potentially you'll need to talk about. Next, motor skill challenges. This is the only stuff on the outside of someone's body that's going to tell you that maybe that individual is experiencing an autism spectrum disorder. Things like graphomotor skills, handwriting, things like buttons, those sorts of things are often challenging. Bigger things like gait, natural rhythm, athletic ability, those things are often challenges for individuals on the spectrum. Lastly, psychiatric symptoms. These are not a direct characteristic of autism spectrum disorder, but you see a lot of them. Living in a world that you don't understand and constantly being misunderstood. Would that student experience some anxiety or some depression? Absolutely they would. So that's something that you do see a lot of, and that you need to have that relationship on which to call, because it may not look the same in an individual with an autism spectrum disorder as it looks in a neurotypical individual. So having that relationship piece is super critical. So now you've heard some about the characteristics of autism. Let's talk about how you're going to help students. We're going to talk about 3 easy strategies. A lot of them are things that you do already. I'm going to ask you to explain the rules, to ask questions, and to facilitate connections. Let's take a look at a scenario to understand a little bit about explain the rules. Earlier this year, Michelle, a student on your campus, disclosed her autism spectrum disorder to you and has been visiting your office frequently since that time to talk and seek advice. Although you enjoy when students stop by to talk, you're having a difficult time completing your work due to the length and frequency of Michelle's visits. What should you do? Think about some of the ways that you might communicate to that student that you're too busy. Things like sighing, things like tapping your pen or doing the clicky or saying like, man, I really have a lot to do today, hoping that that student is going to take the hint. An individual with an autism spectrum disorder may be missing all of those signals that you're sending out. So what you can do in that situation is explain the rules. Talk about how set up some specific rules for how often that individual can visit or stay in your office, or when visiting can happen, or what the rules are for setting up an appointment. Explain the rules of that situation. Other times when you might want to explain the rules, if you see or hear about a social interaction that concerns you, it might be helpful to talk about what the rules of that social situation might be, and you could have a role in that. When you're practicing things like fire drills or some of the just general residence hall policies like quiet hours, your student with an autism spectrum disorder may need more than what's written in the student handbook or covered in a floor meeting. If you're seeing some concerning behaviors, or those behaviors are coming across your desk as part of the conduct process, we hear about that too, try explaining the rules. An offshoot of explaining the rules is also making plans, like the example of fire drills that I mentioned earlier. If you have someone who you know is overwhelmed by sensory information, make a plan or explain the rules of what that student needs to do when the building needs to be evacuated. In particular, if you or that student knows ahead of time that the noise of that alarm is going to be overwhelming, where should that student go? What's the safe space? Is that location the front desk, your office? Is that a place in a hallway? For some individuals, that sound is enough that they may not be able to get out of the building, and you all need to have a plan for what that's going to look like. So explain the rules. The next strategy about which I want to speak is ask questions. This is a segment from the book Aquamarine Blue 5, which I mentioned earlier. It's that collection of essays by college students with autism spectrum disorders. We're going to take a look at Miriam's story. This is essentially her providing some advice both to neurotypical individuals and to non-neurotypical individuals. You're going to see some abbreviations. NT is neurotypical, and ASHFA is Asperger syndrome high-functioning autism. This is from Miriam. To the neurotypical person, ask questions if you want to talk to the Asperger syndrome high-functioning autism person. Ask as much as you need to understand the Asperger syndrome person. To the Asperger syndrome high-functioning autism person, I think the only way to overcome your own intellectual egocentrism is to ask the other person in the hope of understanding the meaning of words this person puts together in a special context. This is an individual with autism telling you, if you don't get me, I want for you to ask. Absolutely. We teach our students every day to communicate. Be certain that you are communicating. If something is confusing, if there's a behavior that you don't understand, if there's something going on that you want to talk more about, talk about it. Absolutely. We have permission here from someone who says, I want for you to ask me. Even if it's a little bit uncomfortable, I want for you to ask. And if I ask you, and that's a little bit uncomfortable, that's something with which you may need to work and talk about too. The last strategy about which I want to speak is facilitating connections. We're talking about connections to students and connections to resources. Connections to students in the residence hall community. If you have an individual that you know has an autism spectrum disorder, maybe you want to be particularly cognizant or intentional about putting that person on a floor with a really strong RA. Somebody who isn't going to make some snap judgments about the kinds of social communication and sensory deficits and behaviors that you see. Somebody that's going to be really interested in building a genuine relationship with that student. Perhaps there are ways to include that student in your building in terms of programming. We talked about how there's typically a really strong area of interest. Is there a way that the programming of your building can support that area of interest and engage the student in the community? Are the activities going on in your community inclusive to somebody with an autism spectrum disorder? Or are they all related to music, for example, something that would be overwhelming for an individual with an auditory sensory integration challenge? Or do they all have to do with watching sports or playing sports? Somebody without a lot of natural athletic ability, that might not appeal to them. So these are the same questions that we ask anytime we're talking about inclusive programming in our residence halls. Then campus organizations help to build a bridge for that individual with common interests. If somebody knows absolutely everything there is to know about aerospace, get that person connected to the astronomy club, to the stargazing club, to the engineering club, whatever that looks like. And maybe you have an RA or another really strong student who would be willing to go with that individual to help and build that connection. Absolutely help to make those relationships happen. Then help that student get connected to resources. On campus, a lot of your campuses have things like support groups for students with non-apparent disabilities, which might include learning disabilities and concerns about mental health. A lot of you have support groups specifically for students with autism spectrum disorder. Get that student connected to the counseling center if that's something that's going to be helpful, or to disability services. Know what's on your campus that you can help connect those students to. I don't know what all of your qualifications are. I'm not qualified as a counselor, and so in the same way that I would refer a student to the counseling center who needs that support, I would do the same for a student with autism spectrum disorder. I'm not equipped to handle all sorts of those kinds of situations that might come across my desk. Off campus, there are a ton of community support groups. If you do just a general Google search about autism support and the name of your city, I guarantee you that you will find at least something that is near you. There are a lot of really awesome support groups for adults, for young adults, for families in that area. So see if there are some community supports. If you have a student who's struggling, help to get that person connected. So I want to close today with a poem. And this is a poem by an individual named Carrie Magro, and he is or was a college student at Seton Hall University, and he wrote this poem as part of a blog for Autism Speaks. He's somebody who is a really big advocate for autism and has pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. Let's take a look at what he has to say about that experience. My name is Carrie, and I have a pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. This means I have autism. This does not mean I am autism. This means I see the world sometimes in a different light. This does not mean I'm in the dark. This means from time to time I may have a difficulty expressing my emotions. This does not mean I don't feel. This means when I communicate, I do it with a style that is my own. This does not mean I don't have a voice. This means I may have sensitivity when it comes to a certain feel or touch. This means sounds can sometimes make me uneasy. This does not mean I'm deaf or hard of hearing. This means I can often focus on certain interests for a long period of time. This does not mean those are my only interests. This means that I'm the only person in my family to have this. This does not mean I'm alone. This means I may have 500 other symptoms or capabilities that are different than yours. This does not mean I am any less of a person than you are. My name is Carrie, and regardless of what PDD-NOS means or doesn't mean, autism can't define me. I define autism. I can only hope those individuals, regardless of being artistic or not, can define their lives and their journeys in the way they see it. What questions do you all have?
Okay, everybody.
About students on your campus or about content?
Yeah, everybody, if you'd like to ask a question in the question box, you can type your question and I can field that for Jill. Or if you would like to raise your hand, we can attempt to call on you, and as long as the audio system is working, we can allow you to interact. So right now we do have one question that came in. Jill, How do you know in advance of students arriving for placing AS-/HFA students in certain rooms or with specific RA types?
How do you know whether or not the student has a diagnosis? Or
Yeah,
how do you know?
I think the person is asking how you would know that in advance, like what mechanisms to gather that information do schools have?
Sure. Well, typically if an individual is requesting housing accommodations, they would do that through your disability services office. And if housing accommodations are requested, you would then be on the need to know list for that information. I would love if that happened 100% of the time. I know that that's not true. So if you do have somebody who is willing to disclose and chooses to disclose to disability services, and then is requesting those housing accommodations, you would then be able to make those sorts of concessions. If you don't hear about it until later, then you may be doing what I know a lot of us have done, which is make some changes mid-semester once you do learn about those pieces.
Thank you. Another question came in. Any thoughts on housing people with autism spectrum disorder together? Is this a recommended practice or avoid it, or is it situational?
I think it's absolutely situational. There's a lot of literature to support students with autism spectrum disorder interacting with other students with autism spectrum disorder and how powerful that is. However, a lot of what we want students to do and gain by living in a residence hall is learning to interact with all sorts of students, and that exposure to living with a neurotypical student or interacting regularly with neurotypical students is going to help that individual to have the skills to be successful in a world that is filled dominantly with neurotypical individuals. So I would say that it's definitely case by case. You're going to need to know your student to know what's going to work best in that situation.
Thank you. Another question came in. Where's the line between personality quirks and autism spectrum disorder?
I didn't catch the last half of that. Will you say it one more time?
Yeah. Where do you draw the line, or where's the line between personality quirks and someone that actually has an autism spectrum disorder?
That's a really interesting question because, as I told you at the very beginning, the definitions of autism spectrum disorder have changed really significantly. So there are a lot of individuals recently who have received diagnoses as adults, and their whole lives just sort of grew up thinking they were a little bit quirky, or folks thought that about them. And so I think it would be pretty tough to say, like, you know, one way or the other, that person definitely has an autism spectrum disorder. One of my very favorite authors, Michael John Carley, basically says that if somebody is experiencing some of those social and communication deficits and has at least one sensory challenge, that person probably has an autism spectrum disorder. That person may or may not have received an official diagnosis about that, but that's what he has to say on the topic. He's actually the director of a global organization for support for individuals with Asperger's. His book, Asperger's from the Inside Out, is one of my very favorites. So he writes pretty eloquently about where that line is, and that we really don't know because it looks different for everyone.
Great. Another question. Is there a rule of thumb for whether to accept a behavior as part of a student's personality or whether it should be corrected? And the submitter submitted the example, I currently am instructing an undisclosed student on the spectrum who fully extends his arm to wave at me before every class. I've caught some students mocking him behind his back, but I enjoy idiosyncrasies which are in some way an expression of personality. So where is that line?
Well, I think that it's up to you to make that decision. This is back to the spinach in your teeth scenario. If you see some students making fun of that behavior, nobody wants to be made fun of. And depending on your relationship with that student, it might be something to mention, depending on that. But typically, I would say when you have to address things, it's when those things are disrupting your community. That's when behaviors are no longer this is acceptable because it's part of this individual's disability. That's a behavior that you need to address.
Thank you, Jill. That's it for the questions that I have in the queue right now. If anybody else has other questions that you'd like to ask, you are welcome to submit it now. Again, you can also press the raise your hand button on the GoToWebinar interface if you'd like us to call on you. But for right now, we're going to pause for just a minute and allow any other questions to be submitted before we wrap up for the day. Nothing has come in yet, so one just came in actually. If an individual with autism is interested in the RA position, applies, and is hired, do you suggest any special training to occur with or for them?
I think that it would have to depend on that individual's abilities. I actually hear that a lot from housing professionals, that they have incredible RAs who are on the autism spectrum, and potentially that's because those folks have received a whole lot of training and support growing up, potentially, about negotiating those kinds of social and communication sorts of challenges. So you may have somebody who is really good in a lot of situations because of those experiences, and would end up being a really strong RA. I think you would do the same that you would do for any staff member, which is find whatever method you're going to use to assess areas of strength and areas of growth, and you would then go in and try to support that student. If that student is comfortable, is planning to, has already disclosed the disability to the rest of the staff, it might be helpful for that student to share the kinds of things that are triggers. If that person still grapples with some of those sensory issues, if that individual doesn't like to be touched or doesn't like loud noises or whatever that is, it would be really nice for other staff members to be aware of that. So it all depends on, again, where you assess those needs are, and also that staff member's comfort level with potentially sharing some of those things. But it's a pretty awesome opportunity of growth, both for that individual and also for your whole staff and the individuals in your building. So,
are there consequences or sanctions that are more effective for correcting behavior issues with students with ASD than traditional sanctions like censure, probation, etc.?
Well, typically, individuals with autism spectrum disorder are rule followers. So if you are having a conduct concern with an individual with an autism spectrum disorder, it's very possible that the rules of that situation aren't clear. There's a lot of writing to support that it's really difficult and sometimes impossible for an individual with an autism spectrum disorder to lie or break a rule about which they're clear. So that's not an absolute, but that's part of it. Something that I would suggest, the idea of a traditional conduct meeting is sometimes overwhelming for an individual with an autism spectrum disorder because there's not a lot of time to think and plan responses. Students are typically expected to come prepared to discuss what happened and their behavior and their emotions and the reason behind that behavior, and somebody with an autism spectrum disorder might need a little bit more time in order for that to happen. So it might be good to alert that student to, here's exactly what we're going to be talking about, and maybe asking that student to come with some thoughts or some talking points in writing, because a lot of times individuals who have some trouble expressing themselves orally are a lot more successful in writing. Students with autism spectrum disorder have great success and affinity for social media, a lot of the times for those reasons, because there's time to think about and formulate responses. So I would encourage you, if you are having some conduct meetings, to give that student a heads up about what exactly it is that you're going to be talking about, and give permission to come with some thoughts in writing if they'd like.
Is taking things without permission a characteristic or trait typical of Asperger's or even atypical?
Not of which I'm aware. I don't know that I've read anything to suggest or support that, but doesn't mean that it's not, and I didn't miss it. I wouldn't know where to direct you on that one.
Okay, that's it for the questions for today. Oh, sorry, one more came in. Good question here. Parents of students without autism can be challenging to work with sometimes. Do you have any suggestions for working with these parents while still complying with FERPA?
Parents of students with autism spectrum disorder?
The question was submitted as parents of students without, but it looks like correction, yes. We intended that to be yes, parents or students with autism.
Okay, super. So basically, we are bound by FERPA to not disclose things to parents. However, I think there's an opportunity with through disability services on a lot of campuses to basically waive that or do some signing that says that parents are permitted to be involved in communication about those issues. And a lot of times, parents are a pretty critical part of the team for supporting students with autism spectrum disorder. It's really important to remember, or at least I think to remember in our role with students and parents, is that our role is to help students to develop the kinds of skills that they need to be successful in the neurotypical world. And so if that means asking a student to do something for themselves that maybe their parents have typically done, that needs to happen. So I think that depending on what sort of releases have happened through disability services, you'll probably be told pretty clearly the kind of communication that you're permitted to have with students. But I feel like it should always be the nature of how are we going to empower your student to make this happen, as opposed to parents, how can you help your student to make this happen. So.
Well, thank you, Jill. We're about out of time for today. I want to say thank you again for the great presentation. Jill, if you'd be so kind as to maybe share your contact information, your email address, if folks have a question that they'd like to email you.
Absolutely. I always love to hear from folks about experiences that you're having, things that work really well on your campus, questions if you have them. I have a lot of great resources to which I can point you, and I'm also really excited to hear about those things if you have them. You can reach me via email at jkwalte@bgsu.edu.